Welcome to the Victoria Anarchist Book Fair's week of podcasts and performances featuring local, national, and international activists and authors.
The Book Fair Collective and From Embers have teamed up this year to release presentations over our podcast platform that can't be held in person due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Recordings of these voices of resistance were conducted on unceded Indigenous territories across so-called British Columbia and beyond.
For more information about the book fair and a full schedule of online events this week, you can check out victoriaanarchistbookfair.ca.
Listeners in the Victoria region are encouraged to visit Camas Books at camas.ca for anarchist publications and more.
Thanks for listening.
The following recording was made on the traditional territory of the Hamalko First Nation on my end and Leicestershire, England on the end of Ruth Kinna. The Victoria Anarchist Book Fair Collective acknowledges the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations and the Saanich Nation, whose occupied traditional territories we organize, live our lives, work, play, and hold our events upon. What follows is a discussion that largely revolves around resistance against social domination. And with this discussion, we might consider our parts to play and the relationships we build in resisting and overthrowing colonial domination. Lest our resistance fall slightly short of an end that we here in so-called British Columbia recognize as the central anti-authoritarian struggle of our lives. My name is Psalm, pronouns they, them. I'm a member of the Victoria Anarchist Book Fair Collective. Ruth Kinna is a professor of political philosophy at Loughborough University. She is and has been part of many research groups, associations, and societies, all having one thing or another to do with anarchism. She's written The Beginner's Guide to Anarchism, as well as a book on William Morris, subtitled The Art of Socialism, and many, many others. But the book we discuss in this conversation is her most recent to date. It's called The Government of No One, The Theory and Practice of Anarchism. Our conversation focuses mainly on this very interesting book. The recording will begin halfway through a thought about schooling as a form of social conditioning. Unfortunately, due to a glitch, we lose the very beginning. Sorry, Ruth. But what follows is a conversation I'm so grateful to have had, and I hope you all enjoy it too.
Schooling and instruction, and how that shift, or what that shift tells us about the kinds of systems the kinds of social systems that we're being indoctrinated into, that we're being introduced into. Such that this is something that comes up very strongly as well with later people like Paul Goodman, that schooling puts you on a kind of a treadmill, on a sort of a process through which your life is then structured, and you become something through it. And some people benefit from that in many ways, but most people don't actually. And what the anarchist is trying to do is to say, yeah, but why do we have education? And what is education doing? And what is this greater sort of process of acculturation or socialization about? And how can we, at the same time, recognize that when we bring people into our communities, be they children or just other people, other adults, that we are sort of introducing them to sets of rules, but that we're trying to become aware of those rules such that they're negotiable, and that we're not then just putting people on particular tracks whereby they have to adopt our practices unquestioningly, but they can contribute to the development of those practices in a cooperative manner and spirit. And I think that's really what anarchist education is about.
Yeah, totally. Do you think that we've made progress in this regard over time?
We being societies?
Oh, that's an interesting question, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of, in some way, that's sort of where we end up, right? Like in the near the end of the book, we kind of come to this conclusion that it's been this like super hard fought battle, but in the end, Like, are we struggling with kind of the same issues, these same forces? And in many senses, like, yeah, we are.
Yeah, we are. I think we are. But that's, what I try and do at the end of the book is to say you shouldn't be disheartened by that. Because it's always a matter of winning people and spaces over. And people do that in different ways, in different situations, and they have to make decisions about how they do that in different times and different places. But in terms of education itself, I mean, I think that I always think there's enormous potential in the existing, even in the existing frameworks. But no, I mean, as things are developing, as things have certainly in the UK have developed in education, no, it's all very depressing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me maybe try again though, because like, so we have this concept of like state sanctioned liberties, right? Like maybe property is one of these like super unimpressive, state sanctioned liberties. I wonder if we've made any progress in this regard, like in our societies, for example. Do you think that anarchism has? You talk in the book about the 8-hour workday. And maybe we can attribute this to anarchism in action. Are there other things that we can look at that sort of alleviate the burden, that have alleviated the burden over time of these dominant forces?
So I think there are always not trade-offs, but balances between the ways we see things and what happens in practice, if you like. But both of those things are important. But I mean, if we think about property, I mean, we live in regimes where property is enshrined, private property, exclusive rights to private property, where we have in huge monopolies of property ownership, where we have these massive corporations, and things can look again very, very bleak in terms of the protections that those kinds of corporations have. And yet at the same time, we have an awareness of commoning, of sharing, physically and virtually. So we have Creative Commons licenses. We have access to all kinds of resources on the web that people can share, and they do this for free. We have copyleft. We have all of these things. We have groups of people across the world who are questioning property regimes, from indigenous people in Canada to Australia. We have people who are contesting the ways in which property plays out exclusively. So we have anti-gentrification campaigns. There are all kinds of things going on. So I think it's easy to lose sight of the resistances, if you like, that come that raise their head. And we tend to just think, oh, well, nothing has changed. We still have this property regime. We still have these rights which are exclusive and which are damaging. But I think, there are questions that we can ask about that, and also sort of positive movements that we can see that move against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's true. I really appreciate how methodically you've gone through and documented this stuff in your book. It's like one of the most concise and dense histories that I can remember reading. I wonder how long the research process was, or if your writing process intersects with your research process.
So, I love reading about anarchists, and I love reading anarchism. I like the characters, I like the people, I like the ideas. So I read continuously. And I suppose what you see in the book is the people I've left out is shocking, actually, when I think about who's not in there. And it's always selective. It's always a kind of a snapshot of the time, because I suppose the writing process, I tended to write the chapters in pretty intense periods of time, and I just wanted to concentrate on the theme, and I guess the people who made it into the book were just people who came into my head because they came first, I guess. But the choices in that sense were sort of random, because I think you could turn to, there's so much in anarchism. It's such a rich tradition. It's such a rich field that there are, I could have replaced everyone in the book with another 10 different people, and talked about the same ideas from different kinds of perspectives. But, I guess it's always selective. That's what I'm trying to say. It's always a snapshot. It's always a work in process. I think that's how I see it.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, does it build from an outline out, or is it kind of just like, I have to write this and I will, and then fit it in?
So no, there is an outline, but the outline is rather shifting. So as you start, I mean, that's always the way for me anyway, that I write, that I think I know what I'm going to say. And then as you start to say it, you look at something slightly differently, or the ideas, that look slightly, they raise different kinds of problems and questions. And so the argument sort of unfolds, more fluidly than you start off. And then there's a huge editing process. So, I mean, the book was probably, another couple of, or maybe even 10,000 words longer, the draft,
oh, wow.
First draft, and then it got edited down to make it a bit neater.
Yeah, and then it's got near the end, there's that really cool sort of microbiography, right? You just hit us with all these little biographies, and as I was reading that, I was just thinking, like, this must have been so fun to write, to condense.
It was fun to write.
Yeah, no,
and it became obsessive. And again, and that also got cut down quite a lot. And but the stories of the people, I think, are really important. And the lives that people have led are important parts of what goes on, I think, in anarchism itself. I mean, I think I said it, I tried to say at the beginning of the book that anarchism is made up of the people who identify as anarchists, and they're not all saints, and they're flawed, and they're people, they're human, but they give their best, and what I wanted to do with those biographies was capture some of it.
Yeah. So the book has this like really interesting character aspect where you take us through all these different people, but it's also largely there to frame these certain tensions that exist within the anarchism project. And, one of them that I think is really interesting and challenging to me, just coming from a place of anti-authoritarianism, you're looking for it, but then in some cases you find authority or domination imposing itself in the form of a collective, or just in some moment you're encountering a non-consensual occurrence of force within your scene. But you take on this quite large issue of conditions and constitutions within anarchism. I wonder if we could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So I suppose one of the things I wanted to, so there's a chapter on conditions, which includes a number of constitutions. So one of the tensions, I guess, in anarchism is, if you start off from an anti-authoritarian position, then there's a question about how far you want to avoid permanence in terms of rules and institutions and norms, and how far you want to avoid rules, institutions, and norms. And those two things are different. So one of the responses that arises in anarchism is that what we want to do to avoid as anti-authoritarians, one of the things we want to do is to avoid any single permanent fixed authority. We want to avoid any particular reference point that says, this is what you have to do in this situation, or this is the person you ask in order to resolve the difference that you have. And what the anarchist says is that we must always avoid having that single point of reference, because life is messy, and because we can't, everything is contingent. We can't, as soon as we give ourselves into that kind of fixed authority, then actually we are going to subordinate ourselves and other people in the process. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't have frameworks within which we try and work out how we resolve these issues or problems. Because if as an anti-authoritarian, you assume that people think differently, people act differently, they have different value systems, different belief systems, and all the rest of it, you have to assume that there's going to be conflicts. So the question is, well, how do you resolve those conflicts, or how do you enable people to resolve those conflicts themselves without falling back into some kind of permanent, centralized, fixed authority? So some anarchists propose that what we should do is we should think about our organizational frameworks, we should think about our principles, and we don't have to write them down, but some people do. And we can modify them, and as long as they're transparent and they are modifiable, then we're not permanently enslaving ourselves to a set of regulations that we then find are oppressive. And then, the critique of that, which is also within the anarchist tradition, is, but anything that you do that's along those lines is inevitably going to be enslaving. So we must resist that at all times. And those two positions are often presented as being oppositional and unbridgeable. And it seems to me that they're not, that they're both actually healthy anarchist responses to a problem of authority. And they both work in tandem. And, if we forget that all authority is oppressive, then actually our rule books might themselves become rather dangerous things. But again, if we think that there are no rules, then we may veer towards a failure of cooperation. We may cut ourselves off from those negotiations and discussions that actually build solidarities. So I think those things go together, although they're presented as different kinds of conditions. Yeah.
And we could maybe talk about Paul Goodman now. Just in he has this advice that he has, the will to be brave, which is kind of cool. Yeah. That's interesting. But before we get to Goodman, which I really want to do, Alan has asked me to talk to you about mutual aid and Kropotkin, right. And maybe this is the perfect place to slot that, right? Because mutual aid as a framework is maybe a way to sow solidarity in the face of this tension.
That's right. I mean, it's obviously it's the central concept for Kropotkin. So Kropotkin writes the book Mutual Aid: A Factor of Evolution, and the whole idea of mutual aid is that it does two things, or three things, I guess. I mean, one, it describes a principle of thin sociability. So the argument of mutual aid is against mainstream political philosophy, if you like, that the idea that you can think of us as separate individuals is simply a fiction. That's not how people live. People are brought into the world, into families, into communities, into societies, and those societies generate their own rules and regulations. And they may be more or less oppressive, but nevertheless, in a very thin sense, we are sociable creatures. We live in groups. We do not, as a rule, live in isolation. And the second thing that mutual aid does is to say, well, if it's true that we're sociable and we live in groups and we generate these rules and regulations that shape our lives, then how can we go about thinking about those rules in ways that are productive and which benefit us as individuals in groups. And the second thing, this is the argument that Kropotkin wants to make, and he sort of says, well, if we think of mutual aid as an ethical principle in that sense of sociability, then we can start elaborating a framework within which we can think about how to expand the realm of mutual aid, which means how we can cooperate with each other as equals, rather than build relationships which are based on domination or exploitation. It's much better for us all to live cooperative lives according to particular ethics. And the third thing he says is that, well, if we want to think about this, then the way that we should think about that is not to think about inverted commas utopian schemes. What we have to think about is sociological experiments. So what kinds of societies have enabled mutual aid as an ethic to flourish? And he goes back into history and he looks at anthropology and he says, well, the best kind of societies are those where people can share things, so you don't have individual property, and where people trust each other, so the rules are made by everybody, and where people are brought into close relationships with each other. So decentralized federation is much better than a centralized structure, which leads you to live rather sort of alienated and isolated lives. So mutual aid is a theory of organization, it's a theory of ethics, and it's also a theory of sociability. And I think it's, different anarchists will understand or will see the organizational aspects of mutual aid in different ways. They'll recommend different kinds of practices, and different kinds of ethics as well, to a certain extent. But the principle of mutual aid as a way of maximizing our cooperative potential, I think, is a central theme in pretty much all anarchism.
Yeah, and you say Kropotkin was opposed to utopianism?
Well, he's opposed to utopianism if utopianism means that we can dream up abstract, we can work on the basis of principle and apply principle in practice, so that we can say, right, so the best society is the society where people are free, and freedom means that everybody has a right to property. So that's an abstract way of thinking. And then you sort of say, right, so how do we realize this? He's definitely a utopian in a different sense, which is to say, since everything in history is contingent, and the only way that you can bring about better states of being is through your own activity, it's actually quite a good idea to have a notion of what your aims and aspirations are and to share those with other people. So to work towards a goal and to elaborate that goal in utopian terms because it doesn't exist, and maybe it's something that you can never fully accomplish, that's actually a positive thing to do for Kropotkin.
Right. Yeah. And now I would love to square this with Goodman, who, and I'd never really thought about it like this before, but to deny people the ability to, arbitrate the details of their own lives or convince them that it's appropriate to abdicate their own personal responsibility with rigid systems that, are fixed relationships and so on. He refers to it as like a widely deployed poor design, right? Just cascading poor designs that are the result of this. And then he sort of proposes certain utopian ideas, right? Right. I just wonder, I wonder how that squares with Kropotkin, but maybe we could just fully go into Goodman now.
Yeah, well, I think actually, Goodman also has, Goodman has, I think, quite a complex idea of utopias, and like Kropotkin, he also tempers them with a sort of a realism, if you like. So, in Communitas, he sets out three kinds of ideal type societies, only one of which is one that he identifies with. But he says you can't, these are going to be, you couldn't possibly imagine realizing any of these ideal types as ideal types And you would also have to think about the cultural constraints in terms of the societies and the times in which you were working. So not all worlds are possible at all the same time. That's one of the things he says. But the other thing he does is he presents a kind of an image of white goods America, post-war, consumer society, this highly technocratic, bureaucratic, managerial, but perfectly clean, crisp, mechanized utopia, and he calls it a utopia. And against that, he then moves and says, but that's not our utopia, right? This is the utopia that deadens people, that causes them to take handfuls of drugs just to take away the pain of everyday life, and it ghettoizes people, and it turns them into bored, hopeless, despairing individuals. But it is a utopia, and it's one that I suppose he calls it that because he wants to draw our attention to the fact that someone did dream this up and managed to impose it on the rest of us. Yeah. So actually, we should feel empowered, if you like, to resist it and build our own.
Yeah. He makes this distinction of possibility and choice. Yeah. Right. And that this goes both ways, right? It's not like just people who are in pursuit of like true, whatever that would look like, liberty. Like the people are seizing possibilities to bring us closer to these like dystopian states.
Yes, that's right. And he also puts education at the heart of that, actually, or miseducation, as he calls it.
Right.
So that's an integral part of the system for him. And he wants us to sort of, part of the re-education, I think, that Paul Goodman recommends for us is to find our authentic selves. I mean, which is, quite a difficult thing to do, but he doesn't think, I think, in the end, the system dominates us, but it doesn't control us. We can push back.
Right. Is this where your interest in Stirner comes in? Because he seems like totally fixated on this particular subject, right?
So I find Stirner very troubling in many ways. But I guess, there are things that I really like about Stirner. And one of those is his sort of blistering attack on the idea of the common good as something that's institutionalized and used against individuals to coerce them. So the idea, this all comes from a sort of a critique of German philosophy, refracted through the lens of the French Revolution. And basically what he's saying is that, what happens in the French Revolution, people represent the French Revolution as the great break from autocracy and the start of the reign of liberty. And Stirner says, but actually what's happened is that the autocracy has shifted. We don't now have these absolutist monarchs who can simply dictate what happens to us at their arbitrary whim. But now we have this idea of humanity and what it means to be a free person, and that's legislated. But we also have this idea of what it is to be free morally, and to be free morally is to do what's good for the collective, whether or not it's good for you. And if you resist that, actually you can be made to conform. So he calls it Jesuitical because he says, what's happened in the state is that the state has controlled this or has this idea of the good. It structures society accordingly. And if you resist the good, if the good is that you have to be conscripted and go and fight in some war somewhere, and you say, I don't want to do that, then you can be compelled or you can be killed. Because in the end, your rebellion it's much better for the state to deal with you as a potential rebel, because the common good is all, and anything that disrupts that good has to be annihilated. And that's the annihilation of the individual. And all of that, I think, is so well put in Stirner. And I don't think it's unique to Stirner. I think that's what Stirner has to say about that idea of a common good. This idea of, someone knows best what your moral freedom consists of. I think that's actually an idea that's shared quite widely across the anarchist spectrum.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are other people who have definitely more tempered analysis of this sort of thing. But yeah, I was just really surprised to see him in here. And you mainly work from this text, The False Principle of Our Education.
Yeah, it's education.
Which is an article that he wrote, and not from The Ego and Its Own, which I think is rare. You don't see many people interpreting from a text like this. So yeah, I just thought it was really cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I suppose it's interesting because he's writing just at the point at which he perceives a shift in education policy that I think still resonates with us. And the shift is one that says, he's saying basically, mass school systems, universal school systems, will destroy the principles on which they're based, which is actually a humanist process of self-development. But that process of self-development has always been predicated on an idea of an enslaved society in which only the elite are educated. And so he's drawing our attention to the tension, if you like, between an elitist system and a mass system, and that, I think, still exists in our own education systems.
Yeah, right on. A lot of these ideas, I think, to some degree are intuitive. A lot of people come to these anti-authoritarian conclusions without knowing the material necessarily. And it makes me think about, because you mentioned safer spaces policies as kind of one of these intuitions in action. I wonder if we could talk about how contemporary radical movements that are not necessarily associated with anarchy have this resemblance.
Yeah. So I think so one of the things I like about anarchism is that it does blur the boundaries between anarchy and anarchism. So one of the things I try and say at the end of the book is that anarchists are not trying to get people to sign up to stuff. I mean, they put a lot of ideas out there and they put a lot of proposals out there, but the idea of anarchism is not to turn you into an anarchist. The idea of anarchism is to enable people to come to their own judgments and work collectively with other people on the basis that they'll have different kinds of belief systems, different values. We're not all going to become suddenly brainwashed into some singular ethic or politics. So the anarchists, I mean, and there are risks in that, because if you say as an anarchist that I think it's preferable for people to come to their own judgments and arrangements and devise their own systems of organization, then it may well be that they'll devise things that you don't approve of. They'll adopt practices that you don't like. And I guess one of the things that Safe Spaces is about is highlighting the extent to which that sense is actually, as you say, intuitive. So when people decide to get together and for a common purpose, what do? Do they immediately elect someone to determine everything for them? I don't think they do. One of the things they do is to say, let's think about how we're going to organize and what the rules of our interactions are going to be, so that we can actually make the most of all of the resources that we collectively share to reach our common goal. And safer spaces is part of that. So you don't have to be an anarchist to think about safer spaces, but it is inherently anarchistic.
Well, gee, I mean, I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to talk about or bring up before we close out here.
I'm just trying to think. No, it's been really good fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ruth, for entertaining this whole process with me. Yeah, like I say, I feel I really had to rise to the occasion to meet you here, and I am
I've really enjoyed it. It's been great fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, and have a great day or a great evening.
Yeah, well, good luck with the book fair.
Yes, thank you very much. See you later.
Okay, yeah, bye.
I'm Kami.
And I'm Franz, and together we are co-hosts of the Doomer vs. Bloomer podcast on the Channel Zero Network.
Every week I'm going to complain about how the world is fucked, things are definitely going to get worse before they get better, and we're all probably going to die.
And I disagree with Kami and think that having hope is important. We can make things better, but only if we believe we can and put in all the effort we're able to into organizing against capitalism and the state.
Yeah, we'll see.
That's the core of our podcast, y'all. It's our shtick. We disagree.
Find our show on SoundCloud or wherever you find podcasts, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Doomer v. Bloomer.